Well, we can begin. It's 10 o'clock here. So first of all, thank you for everybody for joining us here today. We have our 2021 Pandemic Recovery Webinar Series. So this webinar today is really focusing on utilizing data to strengthen some strategic planning and outcomes. So with me today, I have my colleague, Becca Gatus. She's a senior project consultant here at TPMA. And I also have our friend and associate, Josh Wright with MZ Burning Glass. So today's webinar is kind of just an informal discussion. We want to talk about how we're using data, both quantitative and qualitative, to really kind of focus on strategic planning efforts so that as we kind of recover from this pandemic, we're putting good strategies and solutions forward with the data that's best available to us. So with that, I'll pause real quick. Becca, did you want to introduce yourself to the group here today?
Sure, I can. Thanks, Chris. So good morning, everyone. As Chris already said, thanks for joining us. And as he introduced, so I am a senior project consultant, TPMA, specifically my areas in evaluation. So at TPMA, I work with a lot of community organizations and institutions of education and using data to evaluate and improve their organizations and programs. And prior to coming to TPMA, I spent many years in higher education. I have a PhD in quantitative and qualitative research. So it's really exciting to be here today to talk to you a little bit about how you can use that.
Great. Thanks, Becca. I apologize. I should have referred to you as Dr. Becca. my mistake. And Josh, you want to introduce yourself to the panel group here today?
Absolutely, Chris. It's great to be with you and Becca and everyone else here in the pretty early morning in the Pacific Northwest. It's great to be with you. And I'm Josh Wright. I'm the Executive Vice President of Community Insights at MZ Burning Glass. I lead our workforce and economic development team. I've been at MZ Burning Glass for 13 years. We just merged with Burning Glass Technologies earlier this summer. So we've been working through integrating our two great companies. Excited for that. And my background has been in helping our communities both tell stories about how to use this data from a marketing communications perspective. I used to lead our marketing efforts, and now I'm in a leadership role, and I'm a former journalist as well. So passionate about telling stories, helping communicate the value of data, and get it in the hands of people who can affect great change in their communities. So excited for the conversation today.
Great. Thanks, Josh, and thanks, Becca. I think Josh made a great point. The folks who are joining in with us today, I mean, you guys are all here because you guys want to make impacts in your communities and within your organizations using data. So we'll dive into a little bit about how we use data. What are some of the strategies for collecting and analyzing that data? And so with that, we'll get started here. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put some questions in the chat. We have folks from TPMA who will be monitoring the chat feature. So don't be shy, feel free to raise your hand if you have questions or anything like that. And we'll be sure to address that throughout this presentation. So for the next hour, we'll kind of talk about the purpose of a strategic plan, how to collect the data, how to use that data, and then kind of move forward from there. So I'll just kind of begin kicking things off. So folks who may be new to or unfamiliar with the strategic plan, when TPMA puts together strategic plans, we really kind of focus on using it as a tool to kind of provide the direction for your organization for the next 2, maybe 3, 4 years. And part of that strategic planning process is really trying to identify the key activities and labor market trends in the region. So these things can really focus on, what are some of your emerging demographics, industries, occupations, but then also kind of on the flip side, where's the capacity needed to really make sure that we are identifying what the educational and training needs are for those in-demand and emerging occupations. So part of the strategic planning process is collecting a lot of that data, both quantitative and qualitative, and then building out your targeted goals, who are your key stakeholders to really help kind of achieve and carry those actions across the finish line. What are those implementation actions? So what are necessary to really achieve the goals? And then, what are our metrics for success and what's the timeline look like for a lot of that stuff? So we'll kind of get into this here a little bit more, but kind of questions to consider when you're building out a strategic planning process. what does it mean to address the issues in your region? What are some of the best way to create some of the meaningful connections among partners? I think sometimes it gets lost on strategic planning purposes that this is a real great opportunity to really get everybody around the table and really kind of hash out ideas and look at the data, quite frankly. Sometimes, when we come into an organization or to a table to really kind of talk about the data that we're collecting, we're looking at it anecdotally sometimes, but I think having those folks in the room really kind of helps steer the conversation as to, these are kind of the high priorities that the data is telling us, or maybe this is kind of something that's historically been happening. It's not real huge for concern right now. So really trying to get those partners to the table to express, what their insights are and how we can move forward. And then also just making sure that we use our assets and strategies in the region. We hear quite a bit, the region sometimes has its own best practices. So I think sometimes if you bring out those secrets from the backyard and share with what's happening and how partners and individual organizations are doing things to leverage the data, bringing all that kind of activity to the forefront is going to be really important, really valuable for strategic planning process. So from there, I really kind of want to focus. I'm going to kick it over to Josh. So Josh, you guys at MZ Burning Glass have a ton of great data. A lot of data. It's great data. TPMA uses it quite a bit. So how can MZ Burning Glass data really support recovery efforts in strategic plans as we kind of move past this, post-pandemic recovery phase?
Sure. Happy to walk through that just for a little bit, and we can go from there in the discussion. Okay. All right. Okay. I'll keep trucking along here. So yeah, MZ Burning Glass really focuses on labor market analytics, everything from Chris, like you said, emerging demographic groups, how those kind of demographic layers of the labor market. So what are the cohorts of by race and ethnicity, by age and gender, and how are and what are the needs or gaps in those in your market? What are the strengths and weaknesses or opportunities in a region to maybe upskill a specific group to fit the needs of where your region's going, where companies in your region are going, where the remote economy is going. So early on during COVID, we focused, one of the word or the topic that we heard more and more than anything was dashboards, reemployment dashboards, decision-making dashboards for policymakers. We did a lot of that work early on during COVID. MZ released a free job posting dashboard that's still on our part of our free resources. Also a free resume builder for individuals. Help companies look at job postings from a skills-based perspective, just to get resources out there. And that was, we were trying to be scrappy to help our clients, but also help people, individuals, companies, and regions. And as we've kind of come through COVID, obviously, there's still some uncertainty with the Delta variant and things like that. But I think what we're seeing is, as the economy is stabilized, is how the two really big things are for us. How do we help regions find pathways for displaced workers, and how do we connect them to the right education and training and make sure that education and training is relevant from a skills-based perspective? Those are really the biggest things that we've hit on when it comes to recovery and strategic planning around that. One thing I've noticed, and I would love your perspective, Chris and Becca, as you worked in different communities, is the strategic planning process and the data needs for that has changed in the sense of maybe being a little more short-term focused. One thing that also we got a lot of questions about early on in COVID is how do we think, if you're, whether you're in Wichita or Birmingham or in California, how do you think of industry projections, occupation projections, given that the economy was changing so rapidly? So we focused a lot of our effort on providing daily job posting activity, job postings from online sources to make sure that we could that we could help our clients get a pulse on day to day, by company, by industry, by occupation, by job title, by skill, what was happening. That's been historically Burning Glass's focus before we merged as well. So that's going to be a real big focus for us as we think about how do we add the most value to job posting analytics and connect it to the core, really rich government data that is out there as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Josh. I think a lot of things that we were hearing, especially in Q3, especially Q4 last year, um, was, clients are really kind of looking at what were some of those quote unquote transferable skills within some of these occupations. Because understand that sometimes their clients or their individuals in the community were unfortunately displaced from the workforce. Individuals were dislocated, they were furloughed, they were let go. So how can they kind of leverage those existing skills and identify different career pathways to kind of jumpstart into a career? I love that job postings analytics tool that MD Burning Glass has. I think it's great. Our clients love it. We use it quite a bit to kind of focus on, like you say, what are some of those immediate occupations that are being posted by companies in that local region. I think that really helps our clients kind of focus and prioritize efforts to say, okay, we need, healthcare workers in these occupations, but then also kind of looking at it and saying, these occupations aren't necessarily being filled as fast as others. So how do we kind of move the needle and prioritize that? I think that's definitely spot on. Becca, are there strategies that you guys have used on your team to really kind of focus on kind of looking at, the job skills and job training and education requirements, kind of helping that kind of build out into a strategic plan? Has your team really focused on that? Or I guess, how has your clients kind of prioritize some of that data that Josh was talking about?
Sure. Yeah. So really specifically on our team, we do a lot of some work communities. We do a lot of work with educational institutions, particularly higher ed. I know we may have some folks on here that related to that. So it is, as Josh said, the constantly changing of, especially when you think about building out educational programs and training, it is about what is that real time. As you said, right now, it's employment data is always very timely and current, always needs to be, but because it's constantly changing, how do you then, when it comes to, as you said, board decision making, do we add a program? Is this program growing? Is it not? It's really made it more challenging, again, using that data to really understand where things are now, and then how do we use that in the future to make those decisions that we don't want to also be too reactive, because knowing, as we've said, it is very just been changing, as you said, especially end of last year, changing so quickly. Things are starting to stabilize a bit, but making sure that that data is current and that you're using it to make those informed decisions, again, moving forward, again, especially, like I said, we do a lot of work in higher education when it comes to how also just kind of not specific to job skills, but also just how you support students. A lot of the work that we do, again, is understanding what are students facing right now, or part of the new workforce, right? What are the current issues that they have? And again, how are those issues similar to what they had, 2 years ago? How are they different? And then how do we think that's going to keep changing moving forward? And then how does that organization support students to, again, find those skills that are going to be timely and current? So I think that's really kind of, as Josh said, that absolutely that it is really important to use that data to get an understanding of what's happening now, and then how do you move forward for the future.
Chris, can I add to that really quickly?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I lead it, like I mentioned at the beginning, I lead our community work, whether it's a state or a region, or working with individual cities on the workforce and economic development side. But we also have a large segment of clients in MZ got its start in higher education. So we work with hundreds of colleges and universities, and as they use our data, I think one of the big things that we've realized is, just stepping back for a second, if just kind of more philosophically, Brookings, if some of you saw a couple of years ago, released a really great white paper on the future of talent-driven economic development, and that's really where the future is going. So economic development being talent-driven, we all know the importance of workforce. That's also changing a lot through COVID. As we, as MZ and Burning Glass have come together, we really taking a collective approach on looking at skills-based education, so that educational institutions are meeting the needs of businesses in a really kind of more real-time way. Obviously, it takes a long time to develop a program, but the rise of short-term credentialing, micro-credentialing, all the different types of things that online training providers and others are doing. MZ just released a white paper on what we call agile program management, and looking at continuous market research, continually looking at incremental curriculum development. And if you doing that from a skills-based perspective is something that we've seen some institutions have a great effect at looking at essentially the skills that are coming out of their curriculum, out of the specific syllabi in their institutions, and then how does that meet market needs of businesses? Is it relevant? Is it not relevant? And that giving them a pulse is really being helpful. Obviously, that ties into longer term strategic planning as well. But I think especially now we can't predict what's going to happen in 6 to 12 months, but we can know in the last 9 months of where the trends are going, or even more broadly than that, and that the skills coming out of job postings, businesses are giving those signals and how to validate those is really important. And I think if we step back more holistically for a community, it's if your educational institutions are taking a skills-based approach to helping their learners, communities are taking a skills-based approach to their talent development and helping. And we see a lot of chambers, a lot of other regional leaders helping companies take a skills-based approach to their hiring, making sure that their job postings are taking, are they putting the relevant skills that they need in their job postings and giving them tools for that. So that's a whole ecosystem of the skills-based approach that I think is super valuable. And as regions do that, it gives them a competitive edge.
Yeah, you're spot on, Josh. I think, sometimes, we go into some of these meetings and workforce and economic development are kind of going at the same thing, trying to achieve the same goal, but sometimes, not necessarily working hand in hand on things. And I think you bring up a great point that, it's really talent driven economic development. So how to have, workforce kind of at the forefront, helping, working collectively, quite frankly, with economic development on that piece. I want to kind of pause real quick. We had a question in the chat, and I think this is a real timely question. So the question that we had was, do you think strategic planning is shifting to short-term focus because organizations are not capable of focusing on long-term, or is it more effective? Then what's the role of long-term strategic planning, and how is data used differently or different types more suited for long-term versus short? So just kind of talking about how we want to focus on long-term strategic planning versus short-term. I'm going to kick it to Josh first. And Josh, if you can talk a little bit about the data that you guys have with MZ Burning Glass to kind of help focus on what's the short-term immediate needs of the strategic planning versus projecting long-term planning.
Sure. I think just kind of structurally for how an economy operates on the long-term side. So I'll just talk about different types of data for short and long-term. And I'd love to hear your perspective, Chris and Becca, on how that informs, how communities should be thinking or educational institutions should be thinking about strategic planning. But on the data side, when I think of longer term, I mentioned projections that come from the government and think that what MZ historically has adjusted, modified to say, where is the 5, 10-year or 3-year trend for an industry and occupation, or how our skill, and Burning Glass has done some cool stuff on skills projections as well that we're still learning about as we integrate our companies. At the same time, I think projections, again, the economy is changing so fast, so the data is going to be catching up to that. But what's not changing, though, is the structure of an economy. What are the driver industries? What are the core occupations in those industries? That kind of data, that kind of research is super valuable. And even though there is a lot of churn and change in the labor market, regions don't change, the structure of their economies aren't changing overnight. Obviously, some regions want to diversify more, like Nevada has been doing for years, and others, but there's still core driver key industries that drive a ton of the activity and flow of money coming into the region, and having those kind of just base kind of industry target, whether you call it a target industry analysis, core occupations that come from those industries, and then how to feed programs into those occupations and the skills needed. That's kind of a core thing that I still think is really valuable from a long-term perspective. And then really quickly in the short-term perspective, what I mentioned on just the daily, weekly, monthly job posting activity, measuring that against kind of real-time supply measures from resumes, understanding how, looking at other shorter-term variables, like whether it's looking at kind of just shorter term employment trends from current employment statistics, looking at how is the data from QCW, the quarterly census of employment and wages, changing in your region quarter over quarter. Those types of things would be things that I would look at more short term.
Yeah, I think you're spot on that. I think one thing too, and Becca, I'm sure you could probably talk about this too, but when we do any type of strategic planning, facilitation, or working with clients across the country, different organizations, I think the one thing that we really try to preach is, it's okay to be, adventurous or, have these high aspirational goals that you want to achieve. And I think in my mind, that's long-term strategic planning is, if you have these big aspirational goals, how do we take the little steps along the way to get there? I think it's also kind of important to kind of be responsive to what the trends are in the labor market. You have to be quick. You have to be nimble. So when you build out a strategic plan, it's real important that we don't want to make sure that we box ourselves into a corner and say, this is what we're laser focused on because this is what the data is telling us right now. I think part of it is just creating that mindset with whether it's a steering committee or folks around the table who are helping craft the strategic plan is, making sure that we're able to respond to what our partners and what our communities need. But Becca, can you talk a little bit about how you guys kind of preach that sermon in some of these sessions and how you guys build those plans out in response to it?
Yeah, Chris, you're absolutely right. You said I was going to go on lines is flexibility. That's one of the things in when we are especially talking to clients about putting their strategic plan is definitely that they need to understand this isn't just something that you're going to put together for a 3-year, 5-year term, and then you're just going to kind of put it on the shelf and we did our strategic plan and there it is. That sounds silly to verbalize it, but that's a lot of times what happens. Your point, Chris, that, okay, we did it. Here it is. Here are our goals, here are our priorities. Again, we need to be thinking long-term. As you said, that taking those aspirational goals. But then also it's more importantly, how are we getting there in the day-to-day, the month-to-month, the shorter term, but not being so fixated on this is exactly what we said we would do when, again, to your point, maybe the data then has shifted and tells you something else, to not be completely rudderless, right? Not constantly changing, but being flexible, I think is always the key word we use, flexible, to be able to adapt when something has changed. It really tells you that this was a good strategy 6 months ago, but now if we really are trying to get to your point, that aspirational goal we're trying to achieve, we need to adjust course and go this direction. Or again, as Josh talked so much about, use the data to inform our decisions. And they just might look a little different than what we intended. But that, to your point, Chris, that structure is still there. This is where we're trying to go. It's just ultimately maybe there's a different way we're going to actually get there and just being flexible in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to throw it out there in the chat, though. If anybody has, I'd be curious to hear from folks who are attending the webinar, and you put in the chat, but what are some of the priorities that you guys are looking at, whether it's long-term or short-term, that you guys are thinking about? This needs to be included in our strategic plan. These are things that, we don't know, or maybe you just don't know where to place it in that bucket, whether it's long-term or short-term. So I'd be curious, and we could talk about that here on the panel as well. But it's kind of funny. When we were doing strategic planning, I think back in late 2019, right at the beginning of COVID, it always sticks out in my mind. We were in a strategic planning session, and one of the questions was, unemployment's so low, we don't have enough belly buttons for the region. We don't have enough people to fill some of these jobs, right? So how do we do that? And then, fast forward 4-6 months, the conversation totally changed, right? It's like, we have a lot of displaced workers. Now we're focused on, how do we make sure that we understand what the resources are in the community to provide to these individuals to help them. And I think that's kind of where it's kind of going in a tangent, but, looking at community asset mapping, kind of preparing and understanding what's in your region, what are the resources available to kind of respond to some of these needs, what are some of the services available to help individuals overcome barriers to employment, whether they're displaced or whether they're upskilling in a program. So just understanding what those things are. But again, that's going into a tangent. I won't go too far into that. But Becca, I want to kind of pick on you here for a little bit if I can. Josh talked a lot about the quantitative data and how valuable and how important and why that data is. I think sometimes it's lost on individuals that just as important in strategic planning is collecting the qualitative data to kind of validate what that data is telling us or invalidating the data. Can you talk a little bit about the strategies that your team and you have used to really kind of pair those two types of data sets and build out some concrete goals?
Yeah, actually, Chris, you had great point there. One of the things I was going to say is, it's both to using data to both confirm you have a lot of assumptions, probably what you think is happening, but that may be true, and data can help confirm that, or sometimes exactly it negates. And we're seeing that more and more. Just got done with a client that they're what they thought was happening was true, but sometimes there's been a time that's not. So really, to your point, especially right now, as we think about understanding in recovery, how the pandemic has affected organizations, affected programs, this qualitative data is really helpful to get to those goals. So it really comes first and foremost about using different kinds of data. Again, as Josh talked about, there's lots of great quantitative data out there, which can sometimes be a little confusing, and there's so much, right? So it's what are you trying to answer? And so obviously quantitative data answers questions like, helps you know, what is the need? Where's an area of growth? What's the opportunity? What's the priority? Versus qualitative data can really help you understand why that's a priority or why that should be a need, and understand why your stakeholders, really what they're dealing with, again, truly on the ground firsthand. So as I mentioned also, and I think Josh said it too, is that there's a lot of great real-time data out there. You can talk about the dashboard, especially with employment. But then depending on your community and the information you're trying to gather, there may not be, that information could be a year or more older. And especially right now, as we've been discussing, that information may not be as relevant. So really, you're able to, when you are able to go collect some of your own data as an organization, you are able to really understand what's going on in your organization or community. And that other data may be national, so it may not also be as relevant to you. So that can give you more of the full picture as what's happening. So this can include, you've mentioned a little bit of it, Chris, using things like interviews with key decision makers and really those stakeholder engagement through listening sessions, focus groups, engagement sessions. Those really give you the broad understanding of what the strengths are, what the opportunities, really how they're perceiving you as an organization, as again, how they view the region, how they view an institution in a more open-ended way. And it really gets into that why and how again, so we can more importantly come to making decisions. And what do we actually do? Here's what the data says, but here's what our stakeholders say, the reasons why they feel a certain way, or the reason why they're dealing with a certain issue, how it's impacting them, really understand that. And then you can also additionally, to doing interviews, focus groups, you can also create your own surveys that can get more targeted, closed-ended questions to give you still some more generalizable data about your organization, your community, your program, to really help you understand. And then ultimately, to your question, Chris, those are some of the things you can gather. How do you use it, and how do you analyze it? And how do you help it inform your goals and your strategies? Ultimately, it's really about looking for whatever the data is, whether it's an interview, a focus group, and also a survey, right? It's trying to find those key themes. So looking at what are the commonalities across that data. So what were the most frequent responses in our survey? What were the key, as you look at, I had a listening session with a group of my stakeholders. What were the key things that I heard? Trying to use that to get those common answers to help you understand and answer those questions you're trying to know more about. So again, for example, that quantitative data may have told you there's a great need in your community for living wage jobs, but the qualitative, as I said, can really understand why that's the case. And they can both help you figure out, what are the needed industries, where are the jobs, what's the capacity of organizations, how can I help fill those needs or fill those voids? But it's using that why question, and that can help you then determine how you as an organization will ultimately help you build those strategies to achieve your goals. And the one other thing I'd also say is that in those focus groups, especially in those listening sessions, that's where you get a lot of great recommendations. In our work and evaluation, we get a lot of good recommendations about how to improve organizations and programs, and really use that secondary data that Josh has talked about, and or the survey data you may have collected to substantiate what you've heard in those sessions. So it's really using them together to tell, Josh talked about storytelling, right? Telling that story. And Chris, again, it's sometimes that they talk to each other and they affirm each other, but other times they might have some contradictions. So sometimes it gets a little messy to figure out, do I need to ask more questions? Did I ask the right questions? And then that ultimately will help you inform that decision-making, and how do you help fill a need? How do you use those opportunities to leverage your organization?
Yeah, that's a lot of great information. Like, I think, whenever we walk into a focus group setting or any type of one-on-one interview kind of thing, I always like to make sure when we're presenting data that we've collected quantitatively, it's, we're just the consultants coming in, but we're partners. We're not the data experts, so don't take us at our word on this. You guys are here to kind of validate or invalidate some of the data. So you tell us what works, what doesn't work. And I think it's real important to kind of dissect a lot of that information that's being provided, and standing in front of a group, presenting all this information, trying to get some feedback. I think that's an easy thing to do to collect that feedback. But I think it's even harder sometimes for clients to, especially if they don't have a group like TPMA or MZ Burning Glass helping them with the strategic planning process. They have all this data. It's a lot of data, especially quantitative data. How do we make sense of this data? What's the data telling us aside from here's what our top jobs are, or here's the growing industries. So Josh, can you talk a little bit about maybe some tricks of the trade that you guys help tell clients or anything as far as how to use the data without having it be kind of overload on them and kind of creating anxiety?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's anything like any foundational research project or understanding what are you trying to solve, and asking that right question from the beginning and keeping that question and keeping the goal in mind throughout. So I think, as I was just hearing Becca and Chris talk, both of you talk and thinking through this discussion, I mean, if we step again, I'm kind of zooming in and out here on very specific types of data, but if I zoom out and think about the regions who are succeeding, the ones who pre-pandemic and post-pandemic are taking the right steps, it's a lot about leadership. It's a right about which organization and who in that organization, who's going to take the bull by the horns, and who's going to say, okay, there's a lot of noise right now. There's a lot of people, whether it's like Chris, like you said, there's competing workforce and economic development initiatives in our region, but we've got to come together and we've got to be a unifying force. And it's usually 1, 2, or 3 people we see in a region who just say, we know how to connect the right people, hire the right consultant like PPMA, take the right, understand how to make data actionable into a great strategy for a region. It could be very, very specific. Like in Sacramento, they've created this really cool digital upskilling initiative, and that was the Regional Economic Development Group, Greater Sacramento Economic Council, just saying we've got to do this because our companies need digital workers, and they need that we see a clear upskilling and reskilling need in the digital fields. That's the type of thing of we see a need in the data, and we're going to go right to the problem. We're going to go and solve it with a very specific program, and we're going to make it actionable. That is, you can get, the world is we're awash in information, and there's so much data out there. It can become paralyzing. But it's really finding that, again, going down to what are the question, what's the real need for, what are we trying to solve? And let's stay laser focused on that and have a leader drive it to whether we're starting a new program, initiative in the region, an educational program, aligning our training and education, whatever that might be.
Yeah, spot on, Josh. I think to kind of go into that initial question that we had here about long-term strategies versus shorter-term strategies, I think right now everybody's kind of in this position where there's never been so much funding coming from the federal level down to the states with all these recovery efforts and grant opportunities. So as you're thinking about building out a strategic plan, looking at what your goals are in year 1 through 3, 4, 5, whatever it is, kind of keep mindful of what are some of these grant opportunities that exist, whether that's around infrastructure, whether that's around workforce training. I know the EDA has released about 6 different ARPA NOFOs this past week or 2. So there's all sorts of different funding opportunities that align that really kind of help build out some of these initiatives. And one that I think when we do a lot of strategic plans, folks get really excited and geared up about, sector partnership work or building out career pathways as far as a goal and strategy and a plan. So I just say that to say, there's a lot of funding opportunities out there right now to kind of help support that. We're staying abreast of a lot of that information. So how do you kind of navigate your plan to make sure it aligns with future funding so the organizations and communities are competitive going after these things? So I think that's really important. Again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. We're happy to answer any questions, or if anybody has any concerns about some of the stuff that we're saying, hopefully not, you can feel free to get clarity on some of that as well. But I think one thing, Josh, and we've heard this quite a bit from clients. You talked about this data dashboard. I think that's kind of a hot button thing that people get really jazzed about, but they don't know what to put in their data dashboard or how frequently to update their data dashboard. Who are they marketing it to? Who's hosting this data dashboard? Can you talk a little bit about some of the clients that you guys have worked with and how that's kind of been rolled out and implemented?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to bring up dashboards as we were talking about making the strategic plan more like a living and breathing thing. And there's a bunch of ways that our clients are using dashboards right now. But one that a really cool example, I think, is in New Orleans, Greater New Orleans, Inc., which is the regional EDO there. Harrison Crabtree, their head of research, he just did a presentation for a team a few weeks ago and was discussing this, where he was realizing he was getting so many day-to-day questions on, okay, what's unemployment look like? What's which companies are posting jobs? What's going on? That he realized, hey, if we can put a dashboard and put it on, market it to those people that we usually like, regional stakeholders, internal folks, politicians, all those who are asking the questions, we have a dashboard. It's not going to answer every question, but what he realized, they put together a couple different dashboards, marketed those, and the number of questions he's gotten has declined dramatically. So that's one example of just like more real-time pulse of what's happening, whether we're looking at unemployment counts, the job posting activity, maybe combining that, like I said, with some survey work and getting and flowing that data in. I think the key with any dashboard is, like with anything that's living on the web, is marketing it the right way, putting it in a place that's not hard to find, and keeping it relevant. So the dashboards that don't really resonate are ones that, like, whether the data gets stale and old, isn't updated, becomes lost over time, and isn't aligned to key strategic initiatives. So it can just become a bunch of noise at that point. Again, just like there is so much data out there, there are so many dashboards. So capturing people's attention, getting some mind share for them, whoever that audience is really important.
Yeah, I always joke I'm probably the worst millennial when it comes to technology. So having some type of data dashboard that's functional and easy to access and navigate through is definitely important. Becca, are you seeing from some of your clients, maybe from the education side or education training side of the table, what are some of the ways that they're broadcasting information out, as far as, whether it's relevant training programs, education programs, how things have changed in the pandemic era? Is there kind of a best practice for how they're kind of broadcasting and sharing that information?
I think, again, it's Josh. So I'm glad you're talking about data dashboards, Josh, because those are definitely, I think it's spot on with kind of the trend, if you will, that is again, as Josh said, they can be very useful if they're used right, but that's often something, that we're in nighttime at TPMA, we're hearing more and more asking for those and how they can be used. Again, more importantly, how to help create them so they can be used effectively. That's definitely one way that's really helpful. And as far as higher education, it has been, incredibly challenging. And those in higher ed, if they're on this call, they know, has been incredibly challenging just to kind of stay with. There's been so much to react to that I think now we're getting to a point that when it comes to communicating data and, again, being that more forward thinking, that they're actually starting to kind of regroup. And but I definitely think, back to Josh's point, the data dashboards are one way that's, particularly helpful and useful to communicate that information out that we're, again, seeing more and more. But I said, Chris, millennials, right? Millennial too, that it's a brave new world, right, for some folks as well. So there's a lot of need for assistance, and as Josh has talked about, to make sure they're being used well.
Yeah, I think, absolutely. And I think too, obviously, MZ, Burning Glass, has some really great data, but for individuals who may not have access to that type of information, there's a lot of great resources out there that, are publicly available. They're free. Some are a little bit more wonkier, I think, than others. We quite frequently use U.S. Census Bureau data. I believe they used to have American Fact Finder, and that's kind of got revamped in the last year or two. And it's a little easier, to be honest. So it's great stuff there. Bureau of Labor Statistics has some great data as well. Bureau of BEA has some great data. So there's all sorts of different publicly available data. And I would say too, I come from the workforce development side of the table. So I always tell clients, every state workforce agency has some type of data available. It's a matter of just kind of Googling, figuring out what's in your state, For example, I could search Oklahoma's workforce development LMI data, and there'll be a page that pops up. We recently did a strategic or a session with Iowa's workforce development professionals. Iowa has a great resource if you're looking at just kind of a model for how that data is available from the state level. It's great stuff that's available. So I highly recommend, contacting folks at the state, just kind of get an idea of what's publicly available. Becca, I'm sure your team probably uses iPad's data quite a bit. Is that right?
Yeah, it comes up quite a bit in the work. A lot of times it's coming from, exactly that's used a lot in education. So we oftentimes get that data and we get to analyze it and then help use it. What I was going to actually say, Chris, in connection to your question, kind of a follow-up to that as far as how to communicate the data, because there's a lot of information, especially when we work with clients and help, write reports that are, we make our reports, very user-friendly, but that's still not as user-friendly as it normally needs to be for the more general stakeholders. And so one of the things that we've been seeing recently, we always do short summaries that they can provide to stakeholders, but it's really working on that. Josh, appreciate this, that visualization piece. And we do a lot of data visualization, but really making those tools really as user-friendly. So then they can pop them on their website and that they are very accessible and easy to use. Again, as Josh, I think, kind of mentioned, it's those short, digestible chunks of information. That's how people consume information. And so as we've been discussing data, it's overwhelming, right? So it's helping them understand what are really the key findings, the key data points that your stakeholders might be interested in knowing, and giving them that in a very usable form that they can then just put on and use it. And a lot of times what they will do is take that information also, break it up into several blog posts or several different, social media posts. So it's really making it that key is that usability, right? And then we're allowing them to take it and put it on their website and other formats to communicate out, but it's really helping them, giving them that, here's the focus, the most important information that we think is most relevant. And that's, again, as Josh said, that's the trickiest part. There's a lot of data, and that's interesting to say that, Josh. That was one of my first thoughts when we started talking about having this conversation is there's a lot of data and it can be very convoluted. So it's about those key data points and what is going to be most helpful and useful.
Yeah, just to piggyback off that for a second, I think when I think of data dashboards or when I think of any of these, and honestly with strategic planning, I think most of our audiences don't, they can go through scan through an 8-page report or a 10-page executive summary or whatever. But like Becca, to your point, data visualization has become such an important part of this. But also I would just say, when we think of data dashboards, you think about, actually impacting change in your region. It's really less. When I think of data, I think less is more. The principle of less is more. So the data dashboards that resonate the most are well-designed, user simple from a UX perspective, but just hit you with those aha moments of okay, that's a trend that I should be following, or that's a chart, or that's whether we're looking at the share of labor force that has with wages over the living wage, or it's this is a percentage of jobs that have been added. The trends, some of the bigger trends. If you think back, I was listening to an interview with the CEO of Esri, and Esri does an amazing job with their ArcGIS platform and business analyst. They're we don't, honestly, MZ hasn't historically worked with Esri, but we have a ton of clients who put either our data or use Esri to visualize data. And the CEO of Esri was talking about, if you think early on, probably the most viewed dashboard in the world the last year plus has been the COVID tracker, the COVID tracking project. And I'm blanking on the university that pushed that out. Maybe some of you can correct me on that. But he mentioned, I think it's been viewed, I believe, oh my goodness, I don't even want to throw out the number. I think it's in the, it's more than the millions. It just an astounding number of views worldwide. And a lot of that was COVID data very usable, digestible in a way that people, and super relevant. And it was something that people could keep coming back to. And obviously that's an exceptional example, but it's an example of a project that was done in a way that we're grabbing a bunch of data and we're going to make it as usable and as simple and as right there as impactful for people.
Yeah, definitely have kept an eye on that data. Someone put in the chat that was John Hopkins data.
Yes, thank you.
So thanks for saying that. We Yeah, because I think it's also really important when you're talking about the data and having it in a digestible format. Understanding, what are some of the data features that kind of trigger excitement or interest in people most. And it just got me thinking about, I was just recently doing a planning session for a client, and the mayor was in the room. When we pulled up our graphic of commuting patterns, and TPMA does a great job of looking at on the map data through US Census and building out, whether it's an importing or exporting community, where those workers are going, what's the age category of those workers. Those are the kind of things I think get people looking at. They can see it on a map and they say, well, that's weird. Like, there's where our talent retention issues are. They're going this way versus coming in here. So just understanding, what your audience looks like and, how they prefer to digest some of that information is pretty powerful. And I think when we build out our strategic plans, I always tell folks it's really helpful to have a plan on the page, exactly to what, Josh and Becca are saying. Myself included, I don't want to be sitting there reading a 50+ page document with data and our goals and our strategies and our action steps. So if you can build it out into a 1-page document, that way, if you're having a quarterly board meeting or a monthly meeting or having a town hall session, bring that stack with you and say, here's what we work on, here's what we're looking at. And I think that's a great way for people to get on board and get buy-in to the strategic plan itself. So I wanted to kind of build out to kind of taking a step back before any type of data collection takes hold. When we do a strategic planning process, I think it's real important to kind of look at existing assets and existing reports and materials to kind of get a sense of what has your organization, what has the community done leading up to this point when it comes to strategic planning. What type of reports have been developed already, whether it's by like Becca was saying, whether it's by educational partners in the community who put their own reports together, whether it's a SEDS plan, a WIOA plan, what are some of the activities that folks in the region and partners are doing already so that we can kind of either leverage that momentum or kind of avoid duplication of work and activities. So when we go into any type of strategic planning process, we like to kind of first dig our heels and to look at what those activities are. Kind of build it out into a score sheet to say, here's what workforce is doing, here's what economic development's doing, here's what education's doing, and kind of go from there. And then I think it's real important to start building out that data collection process. And as Becca said, part of that's really kind of validating or invalidating that data. We like to host planning sessions with steering committee or huge stakeholders in the region to kind of look at the data and really build out what are our goals, what are our strategies, what are our action steps that we need to do to make sure that this strategic plan is relevant, it's reflective of what the data is telling us so that we can propel forward in a good position. So from there, we facilitate this planning session. We come back, roll up our sleeves, kind of clean up the language, strategically move things around, and then present that out, whether it's at a community forum or to a board of directors or anything like that, to really kind of roll out the implementation of this plan. So I think all those steps are necessary when you're doing a strategic plan, but I'd be curious to hear from folks in attendance here if there's some strategies that have worked well from their standpoint, as far as building out a strategic planning process, or if there's just alternative strategies that they have used that's been effective as well. So we can kind of pause away, see if anybody have any questions. But Josh or Becca, is there anything we want to make sure that we're covering or we touch on as it relates to a data-driven strategic plan?
I think this has been a great discussion, hit on a lot of the key points. I just will reiterate, I think it does come down to how do we turn, so much data, so many data points, how do you boil that down into an actionable strategy to affect change? And hiring, whether it's hiring the right consultants, having the right people in the room, having that awkward conversation maybe to say who's going to lead and all that kind of stuff. Those are super foundational points that I think can't be stressed enough. And excited to hear more from the audience as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would just say, Josh, kind of piggyback off that, is that definitely one of the, when you talk about making actual recommendations from data, a big part of it that obviously we're not digging into a lot today, it's not the focus, is the analysis. And if you're collecting your own data, and then also even if you're using other data, right, how do you interpret it and how do you actually use to inform it? And so I think it's great as you go into the plan, knowing who do you have maybe on your staff that can help, or do you need to seek outside help to make sure that as you go through the process, as you're looking at the data, you're looking at it There's always 10 different ways you can probably look at it, but making sure that you're being critical and that you're using, again, resources that you're interpreting it as well as you can. And then that's going to inform and make those recommendations that are going to be, hopefully more powerful for you. And that will actually get you the direction that you need to go. So I think that's also really important to think about. And just the other thing, as you kind of already said, Josh, is that really going into it, it seems very basic, but thinking about what you want to know more about before you get into it too deep, because there is just so much out there. And so Josh, just want to reiterate that. You said it once, I said it once. It was one of the first things that came into my head when we started having this conversation. More data is not always better. Just to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, great point, Becca. And like I said, we'll hang out here for a couple minutes, but Josh, if you want to put your contact info in the chat in case anybody has any questions, or if they want to kind of navigate through MZ Burning Glass website to kind of see what type of data is available. Like I said, we use SkillFit, we use job postings, analytics data. There's all sorts of great things available that MZ Burning Glass has to offer. Becca and myself, we're with Thomas P. Miller and Associates. So we definitely can offer a lot of different insights or facilitate any questions or answers that folks have on this call. Happy to do that. Like I said, I think Josh brings up a great point. When you're doing strategic planning, it's really important to have leadership at the table. And sometimes bringing in a third party can kind of help soften the mood or kind of facilitate, what priorities are among different partners. So, we're happy to do that. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions you guys may have. And like I said before, there's a ton of grant funding opportunities kind of coming through the pipeline right now. There's all sorts of webinars being hosted, whether it's through EDA or TPMA or whatever. So feel free to kind of ping us if you guys have any questions on any of that. We're definitely putting some strategies together. So we'd be happy to help you guys with strategic planning efforts, but then also kind of pursuing different grant funding opportunities as they come through the pipeline. So with that, let's see, I got Josh's information here in the chat. Feel free to reach out, like I said, to Becca or myself and kind of keep tabs. We're going to be having additional webinars coming up in the future with TPMA. So all sorts of different topics. There's a lot more experts in the industry aside from Becca and myself and Josh. So I encourage you guys to kind of stay tuned for a lot of that information. And if you don't have any other questions, we can call it a wrap for today. So Josh, thank you for joining us today. I know it's pretty early over there in the Pacific Coast, but we definitely appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Becca. Thanks, everybody, for joining.